I had in mind this morning just to wrap up one loose end from the previous entry, and that had to do with Ensign Stebbings' poem about a broken sword, which included the little detail that he'd survived the Alamo, which of course blows the whole thing and reveals it as a satire. And that was only going to take me about 10 minutes. However, as I got into the background of that, it mushroomed into an entire presentation that's probably going to be rather lengthy. Now, I also have to say that aside from my usual insomnia, I had my second COVID-19 vaccination yesterday, and some people report flu-like symptoms and fatigue and so on. It's just making me a little bit loopy, like I'd had a couple glasses of wine or something. So on top of my usual spaciness, this could be a little awkward. So we're going to be very informal here. I've got a lot of material, antiquarian copies and things, and I have to kind of set the stage. The whole purpose of this is to show when I come out with my paper about Edgar Allan Poe and the Raven, and about how Edgar Allan Poe falsely claimed that poem and stole it from Mathew Franklin Whittier, I want to establish that I'm just not indulging in magical thinking, that I'm just not reading this in, that Matthew actually used these techniques by which he revealed that he was the real author of the Raven. So I know that's the first go-to skeptical objection, to dismiss everything out of hand, is that, I'm just reading this into, Matthew's work. He didn't really, leave these messages. Well, he really did. So we're going to go to this Trismegistus signature, and one of his main characters, which evolved from this signature, Ensign Stebbings, the Faw military war hero. And the first thing we're going to do is establish that Trismegistus was Matthew's pseudonym. Now, when I establish things on video, I only show you a fraction of the evidence. So it behooves you to be interested enough from what I show you to go and look at the rest of it. See, that's the whole point of the thing. Instead of giving you an excuse to dismiss it because it's not enough evidence, this should intrigue you enough to where you want to go back and look at all of the evidence. It doesn't happen, but that's the idea. It would be the rational thing to do. So Trismegistus shows up first in the February 29, 1828 New England Galaxy. 1828. February of 1828, Matthew is 15 years old. He's been writing for about 3 years for this newspaper. He started when he was 12 years old. Pretty sophisticated stuff. He's a real child prodigy, which I can show. But anyway, this is published on February 29, 1828 in the New England Galaxy when Matthew was just 15 years old. And it's called Ideas on Poetry. And it's a fairly serious essay on the quality of popular poetry. So I won't go into all of it. The whole point of it is simply to show that this is the first signed Trismegistus piece, that it was in fact Matthew's. He picked up that pseudonym from his future wife, Abby, who was 4 years younger, but who was tutoring him already. She was also a child prodigy. She was brilliant, and she had had the benefit of a higher class tutored education, which she was passing on to him because he was unable to afford to go to college. So she was his college. I'll just read the opening, say, half a paragraph or so. Mr. Editor, I am an insatiable reader of true poetry. That is to say, I read whatever is published at the present day and think myself all the while very profitably occupied. It constitutes as large a proportion of our literary atmosphere as oxygen does of common air. No man can live in modern times without breathing in modern poetry, and no man can breathe it in without feeling its effects. It is in this circumstance, without doubt, that we transcend our forefathers and all the world beside that have lived from Homer's time down to the present era. As to the Augustan age, a comparison cannot fairly be drawn between Ovid, Horace, Virgil on the one side, and our own illustrious poets on the other. We must wait till the latter have acquired their immortality like the former, and so on and so forth. Obviously, he's had an education. It's hard to believe this is a 15-year-old boy, but keep in mind that this is the younger brother of John Greenleaf Whittier. He would have had the same advantages in terms of education. Now, John Greenleaf Whittier went to the local Haverhill Academy. Matthew went to the Academy of Abbeypoyen, his tutor, but they would have had the same home school tutoring and the same one-room schoolhouse, and presumably the same genes, So there's no reason to disbelieve that Matthew could have been every bit as bright and talented as his older brother. Even though the Whittier legacy would have you believe otherwise, it's just strictly a, nasty rumor, basically, that his younger brother was stupid and John Greenleaf Whittier was brilliant and there can't ever be two geniuses in a family. It's all bullshit. So anyway, that's the beginning of Trismegistus. Now, again, the editor of the Carpetbag, in which these pieces appear, Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber, wrote in his memoirs that Trismegistus was originated by a career academic, a teacher and principal named Benjamin Drew, who I think also worked with Shillaber on the Boston Post, which is probably how they got to know each other. That's a lie. I got into Benjamin Drew's private papers through a researcher, and what I found was very strange. In Benjamin Drew's diary, there are a couple of these Trismegistus poems. It's not signed Trismegistus in his diary. It's signed Trismegistus in the Carpetbag. But Drew claims these poems for himself in his own diary. Well, that would seem to be proof that they're his, except that I found out that in the 19th century, people would share their diaries with family. That means if he wanted to impress his wife and or his children, and he wasn't really that talented a writer himself, nor very original, I don't think. He certainly didn't have the edge that is clearly shown in the Trismegistus pieces. So if he wanted to impress his wife, he would plagiarize these things and claim them in his diary and then share that with his wife as though he'd just written it, see? So there is motivation and precedent for such a thing. And the other thing is that his background was kind of, I think his mother was Calvinist, real hard line, Puritan. And his father was kind of not very religious, kind of just barely religious. And he gradually gravitated toward his father's position. There's no indication that he was a mystic or that he studied Hermetic teachings, or anything like that. There's no reason why he would adopt the pseudonym Trismegistus. But there's every reason why Matthew would, based on Abby's clear track record of esoteric studies, see? And then we have Matthew's track record of having used this pseudonym. Now, you would have to say that was complete chance, that somebody used, unless you think it was Benjamin Drew, because they're about the same age, unless you think that was Benjamin Drew back in 1828. It's going to be a hard case to make for that, see? So, meanwhile, we have Matthew's first editor on the New England Galaxy, Joseph T. Buckingham. This is a later copy, but this is his memoirs, written in 1852, which is about the same time that Trismegistus was getting popular in the Carpetbag. So therefore, even though I think Matthew swore all of his editors to secrecy, Joseph T. Buckingham couldn't resist the chance to tell posterity that Trismegistus, who was prominent in the Carpetbag, had actually written first for his own paper, the New England Galaxy. So therefore, I think he mentions it, but disguises Matthew's name. The weird thing about this is that his person that wrote Trismegistus, Moses Whitney, which is kind of a distortion of Matthew's name, Mathew Whittier, with the same first initial and the same first four letters in the last name, he supposedly had died. So why even bring it up at all? Because Matthew wrote only like 4 pieces as Trismegistus, whereas he wrote a whole bunch of work for the New England Galaxy under a pseudonym, the initials NNK and a few other things. So, and he says, in his memoirs that Moses Whitney wrote under a whole bunch of different pseudonyms. Well, Trismegistus was not the one that he wrote under primarily. That was only like 4. And it can't be the same Trismegistus if he had died, because this is 1851, 1852 that Trismegistus is showing up in the carpetbag. It has to be another one. So the whole thing doesn't logically make sense if you try to connect the dots. Obviously, this was the same writer back in 1828. So he says, while the galaxy was thus conducted, the labors of the editors were lightened by the contributions of Moses Whitney, Jr., a young gentleman engaged in mercantile pursuits. Well, Matthew was, in fact, engaged in mercantile pursuits, so that cuts the odds, way down, or way up, I should say. Makes it much, much less likely that we're talking about anybody else, because how many people were able to write this well as a boy and were also engaged in mercantile pursuits? Matthew was doing this primarily in New York, but also apparently in Boston. He says his pieces are signed Trismegistus. Now, he had written many brief paragraphs for the paper in years preceding. Well, Matthew started he's talking about 1828 or so, but Matthew started in 1825. And he says he had written many brief paragraphs for the paper in years preceding under various signatures. Now, that's unusual. Not very many writers used a whole bunch of different signatures. Some did, but it was pretty rare. Usually they'd either sign with their name or their initials or one pseudonym, maybe 2. Okay, like Samuel Clemens was Mark Twain. Everybody knew that Mark Twain was Samuel Clemens. There was no question about it. And so on and so forth. I could give a dozen examples. So this habit of writing under a bunch of different signatures was unusual. So when you have these 2 very specific indicators that he was pursuing a mercantile career and that he signed under many different signatures, I mean, there's hardly any contenders after that. It's got to be Mathew Franklin Whittier. And he says, generally on light and transient topics which had no other importance or claim to notice than that they afforded opportunities for the exhibition of the wit and humor for which their author was celebrated. Well, actually, it's not that he was celebrated. He is celebrated. At that time in 1852, he's the author of Ethan Spike, which is famous at that time, except that it's not known that it's Matthew. Joseph T. Buckingham must have known that that was Matthew. So he says that his exhibition of wit and humor for which the author was celebrated, what he means is celebrated, including the Trismegistus pieces that are now currently running in the carpetbag. So what he's doing is, he's kind of half complying with Matthew's request for anonymity by trying to disguise him, but he's not disguising him all that well. So that was Trismegistus in 1828 that we just saw. Now, in the carpetbag, I've got in my notes, this character of Ensign Stebbings first appears in the May 17, 1851 edition. It's an introduction. It's a fall biography, just like Matthew did back in 1833 or 34 when he wrote The Life and Adventures of Dr. Dodamus Duckworth, which historians have mistakenly attributed to another of Matthew's early editors, Asa Green. Matthew wrote for Asa Green in his Berkshire American in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, back in 1828-29, something like that, or even earlier. I have to look that up. And then when Asa Green moved to New York City in late 1829, Matthew moved up there, continued to pursue his mercantile career, and wrote for Asa Green's first newspaper up there, the New York Constellation. Very soon he took over all the editing duties for that paper and became the de facto editor, while Asa Green apparently ran his bookstore up there in New York City. When the cholera epidemic came in 1832, Matthew left, the paper folded. Matthew went probably back to his hometown of Haverhill, Massachusetts, began collaborating with Abby on the book that I've showed you recently, Chanticleer, and began writing 5 books, all of which were mistakenly attributed to Asa Green, including The Perils of Pearl Street, in which he draws upon his knowledge of the mercantile world in New York City. It all ties together. So this is the first one, May 17, 1851. And I'm going to pull that up on the screen here and pull up the book. This is volume 1 of The Carpetbag. Very rare. You can't get this anywhere. Now, where did I put my dollar store pillow? Here it is. There we go. And I'm going to open to the very first one gently. Okay. I'm going to bring this down where I can see what I'm doing, hopefully. Right under the editor's page introduction, some people call this a masthead. Apparently there's a confusion of terms. It says, written for the Carpetbag, Ensign Stebbings, and he introduces the man as though he's a real person. Says, but this introduction, and I've mentioned that Matthew always has like a philosophical introduction. The philosophical introduction actually is autobiographical. It relates to himself as an excellent unknown writer who is not appreciated. Okay, so this part is autobiographical. I'm going to read it. The great men who reside in cities fill a large space in the public eye. They have become well known and fully appreciated. The press is open to the praises bestowed by their friends and to the censures cast upon them by envious or malignant foes. But the great men who live in small towns or villages often pass their lives unknown beyond their immediate neighborhood. No opportunity occurs to give their influence its due weight in the affairs of states and nations. No senate listens to their eloquence. No press blazons their fame. Occasionally, however, in a representative government like our own, one of these great men is drawn from his native obscurity to occupy a seat in the general court, and there he finds, quote, fit audience, though many. There the light which had been obscured beneath a bushel, and Matthew's editor on the Portland transcript accused him, as Ethan Spike, of hiding his light under a bushel. His brother said that he was not forth-putting on his own account. So that was Matthew's temperament. Is placed on an elevated candelabrum. Then the eloquence which had hitherto been wasted on the debating society, and Matthew had been a member of the Nixian Club debating society in Portland in the 1840s, or almost wasted on town meeting arguments touching the herring fishery or the road tax, suddenly charms the ear of listening hundreds, is penned in phonographic character and immortalized in daily newspapers. But all great men cannot be representatives. Some belong to a hopeless minority party. Some are proscribed for heresy by people who are righteous overmuch. Matthew was shunned. Matthew and Abby were both shunned. Abby because of her occult interests. And some sink to unknown graves with the blackness of darkness resting on their memories through the combined efforts of envy, malignity, and detraction. Okay, so this happened to Matthew. His legacy was completely obscured, which I am in the process of trying to bring back out again. I wish, through your columns, to rescue one of these great men from present obscurity and future oblivion. I mean the man, say rather the hero, whose name stands as the caption of this article. He's now moving on to his fictional character of Ensign Stebbings. And if you have set it up in ordinary type, I must here beg you, Mr. Editors, to remove it and substitute black letter or antique instead as an emblem of that broad firmness, decision, boldness, and indomitable immobility of character which characterize, and then in bold print here, all caps, Ensign Stebbings. And it goes on like that. Well, you see the picture of Ensign Stebbings, and the satire begins to come in with the drawing. Now, I've pretty much determined that the artist that Matthew was using was in the know. So you can see in the drawings Matthew's satire reflected. So he knew. And Ensign Stebbings is not a very pleasant-looking character here, and that's intentional. And when Ensign Stebbings writes back later, he protests it. See, this is the subtlety that's going on. This is not me imagining this stuff. So I don't think I need to read the whole thing because it's very long. But we get down here and he breaks into song. Now, Matthew was an excellent poet, so he could incorporate poetry into his humorous writing. And he cuts it very close, very close. It looks serious. It's meant to be initially taken as serious, and yet he'll throw in deliberate, red flags for anybody that's paying attention. So he does that here. Gosh, I got this very small type. When they go to poetry, they decrease the size of the type a couple points. So in this one, it all sounds completely straight, but here's the thing. Matthew hates the idea of manifest destiny. He thinks it's just raw, and it's an excuse. It's a philosophical excuse for imperialism, and he lampoons it whenever he gets a chance. Well, this Ensign Stebbings is a great fan of manifest destiny. So we finish the poem. 3 cheers for the flag of the free. 3 cheers for the flag of the free. Hurrah, hurrah, hurrah. This is the ending of his poem. And upon this, the whole sewing circle, he's reciting this to a sewing circle, catching a spark of the ensign's fire, set up such a deafening shout that the old cottage rocked to its foundations. The poultry without took up the hurrah. This is typical Ethan Spike stuff, the poultry. And a hoarse old Cochin China rooster, which breed he used to make fun of, brought up the rear with a crowing so vigorous that it would have enchanted Chapman himself. Hold on, roared the ensign. Let me concentrate my energies for one more verse, a sort of prophecy of what will be when we've grown up to our true American mammoth newspaper size. Pardon my stumbling. So he breaks into song once again. That flag shall wave on the east, where sunrise paints the sky, and its limit shall be on the west, where the setting sun doth lie. It shall gleam o'er the frozen north, where the pole sticks up through the snow, and its bounds shall be on the south, as far as we choose to go. Matthew was a very strong opponent of the Mexican-American War and the appropriation of Texas. See, so says here paused the song, and if you like the ensign as well as I do, you may expect 1 or 2 more of his efforts from one who deems it no little praise of himself to say that Ensign Stebbings is the friend of, and he signs it, Trismegistus. Okay, so you get a sense of how he's working here. Now, the next, let me get my notes out from underneath here. The next piece appears in the May 24, the next edition, and it is called 5440. Now, I've taken down this little explanation from the reference.com website, which I will read for you verbatim. The phrase 5440 or fight was a slogan created by Democratic, that's the conservatives, nominee James K. Polk in an attempt to rally the public in support of removing control of portions of the United States, including Texas, California, and Oregon, from the British. Geographically, the 5440 line refers to the northern borderline of Oregon, which then formed the northernmost limit of the territory the U.S. sought to acquire from Britain. The idea behind acquiring additional land from British control derived from the concept of manifest destiny, which played a crucial role in shaping the domestic policies of the U.S. Okay, put that under my dollar store pillow. Now, the carpetbag was not the beginning of all this. It actually started with something called the Boston Pathfinder. The Boston Pathfinder was printed in the same office and connected with this little book, which is the Railroad Guide, the Pathfinder Railroad Guide printed in Boston. This is something that Matthew would have made use of in his travels as a postal inspector. Okay, so the Boston Pathfinder came before the carpetbag, and this particular edition is dated from after the carpetbag had already launched. It's the May 29, 1851 edition. And on the very back, reprinted, is this exact same article. Here it is right here. I'll put it up on the screen too, but just in case you want to see it in the original, 5440, signed, and the signature is retained, Trismegistus. Okay, you can't even find a mention of this, no less find an actual copy. You can barely find that it existed at all. It was a free newspaper driven by advertisements. And Mathew, writing as Quails for the Boston Weekly Museum, which I've proven was not Osh and Dodge, mentions stopping somebody on a road in the deep country on the way to Canada or back from Canada. He was visiting his second wife, and who would take their children back up to her native St. John. See, so he was on his way up there. And he stopped somebody on the road who supposedly had a copy of the Pathfinder, which contained Mrs. Partington's portrait. Well, what it shows is that before the carpetbag was ever launched, Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber and Mathew Franklin Whittier were collaborating, because it was Mathew who wrote that fall biography of Mrs. Partington and not Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber. I know all this stuff sounds crazy because so much of it is new. It's new because Mathew hid himself so well, okay, that everything of quality that he did practically was claimed by somebody else. And so it all has to be undone. And it just sounds like I'm just crazy making up this stuff. You know, I'm not. Okay, so 5440. And he goes on about this. And then he has a poem in it. And we still haven't gotten, I think, to the one about the Alamo, which is coming up, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see. Yeah, that's the last one. So there's a poem in here again. I'll just read a little bit of this. In 1845, when the 5440 rallying cry awoke the sons of freedom to a sense of danger, Ensign Stebbings, leaving, like Cincinnatus, I don't know the reference, his potatoes half dug, seized the standard that he had borne triumphantly over many a blood and smoke-stained militia muster field through the ensanguined horrors of the sham fight. Well, Mathew very often made fun of military musters, you know, so he's doing it again. He's making fun of Ensign Stebbings' great claims to being a hero from having fought in the military musters. See, well, you get an idea of that. So we're going to move on to the next one, which is the June 7, 1851 edition, a couple editions later. It's a letter from Jehiel Stebbings in his town of Spunkville, which Mathew had created, like his town of Hornby for Ethan Spike. This is Spunkville. And it's a letter from Ensign Stebbings, dated May 20, 1851. I'm going to move it over here so I can see it. And this is him writing, Mr. Editor, a neighbor of mine who recently visited Boston informed me on his return that I had begun to make some noise and stir in the world, and he loaned me the paper which contained a sketch of my character and a likeness of my face. My friends think it a very good likeness of my humble self, excepting that it has an expression of scorn rather than of determination, but let that pass. So as Mathew Franklin Whittier, in collaboration with his artist, Mathew had purposely put an expression of scorn in Jehiel Stebbings. But as Ensign Stebbings, writing into the paper, he protests it humbly. You know, this is Mathew's method. And when I come out with my paper and I show these subtle methods by which Mathew made it clear, abundantly clear, that he had written The Raven and that Edgar Allan Poe was a literary imposter, he's using this same kind of subtlety, but it's not up here. It's not my imagination. He really was doing this, okay? None of this should be necessary. You know, a word to the wise should be sufficient, but we have a lot of stubborn people who will immediately rescue themselves by saying that I'm just imagining all this subtlety on Mathew's part in these clues. Well, I'm not. So I won't read this. There's lots of funny bits in it. But we're going to go to the last one, which is what I initially intended to share in the first place, which is in the July 19, 1851 edition. This is called The Broken Sword, and it introduces a poem and ends with the poem. So I'm going to read some portion of this. Let me go through it and see if I can find the crucial part. It happened at a regimental review that Ensign Stebbings, in executing a rhetorical flourish, broke his sword blade from the handle, a famous old Toledo blade, which had been used by Lafayette at the Battle of blank, and which was presented by that gallant Frenchman to the father of the ensign. That father bore it at Plattsburgh, and dying bequeathed it to Jehiel, the ensign, telling him to use it for the glory of his country and in defense of the Union. Pale, the ensign looked at the shivered weapon. Thrice he essayed to speak, but his grief was too big for utterance. A luckless corporal offered to buy the fragment, saying he would convert it into a carving knife. Indignation came to the ensign's aid, and thus he improvised. And I'll start it out and then go down to the crucial section here. Buy this, thou little corporal, where wilt thou get the gold? The Bank of England's hoarded heaps, its coinage new and old? Wilt tender me the millions stamped from ancient Spanish mines, or bring from all the Ural chain the yellow ore that shines? Wilt offer me the hidden wealth which spangles in the brooks, where cold dirigo tickles trout in Appalachian nooks? I'll go ahead and read the rest. Wilt scrape the diggins wet and dry where Plutus holds his court, and pile the Californian rocks high as Gibraltar's fort? Do this, do more, 'twere not enough to buy this noble sword, to turn it from its mission high, to grace thy humble board. This sword the brave Lafayette bore. Lafayette fleshed its steel. I don't know if that's flashed. It's written fleshed. Base knave, what demon whispered thee 'twould carve a joint of veal? My sire on Plattsburgh's bloody day was seized by belt and button. With this, through foes he hewed his way. Thinkest thou 'twill carve thy mutton? And I, the ensign, look at me. Listen to what I say. I bore it at Alamo's fall, and proud Jacinto's stay. Well, he didn't bear it at Alamo's fall. Okay, so now he's exposed the entire thing as bullshit. There's just a couple more here. When giant Crockett, fighting, fell, save the flag, he said, I wrapped the bunting round my arm and swung this trusty blade. I cut my way through Creole crowds who strove my road to bar. I've sewed it on my nation's flag, that self-same Texan star. And dost thou think to buy the blade to which such memories cling? No, this with Hessian cap and gun from State House walls shall swing. Trismegistus. He saved the flag from the Alamo, as Crockett urged him to do, see? So it's all bullshit, the whole thing, which means his entire philosophy, everything he stands for, is all bullshit in Mathew Franklin Whittier's opinion. Now, when I get into Edgar Allan Poe and I show you all of these clever methods that Mathew used to expose Poe, as an imposter, and to very strongly suggest that he was the original author, it's the same techniques that he's using here with Trismegistus. And in terms of Poe claiming it, it's the same blasted dynamic that's been happening all along with Benjamin Drew and Ossian Dodge and all of these people, Margaret Fuller, all kinds of people that claimed Mathew's work for themselves because he insisted on remaining anonymous and he would not come out and defend himself. And again, his pieces got to be so well known and celebrated that people wanted to know, the public and the scholars both wanted to know who had written it. And eventually somebody stepped forward, or somebody was suggested and they demurred and said, oh yes, that was me. Benjamin Drew might have said, Benjamin Penhallow Schoenberg years later might have said, was that you writing Trismegistus? And he says, yes, it was. And then he brings out his diary and shows him the two poems and proves it to him, see, that were written before, ostensibly anyway, before the carpetbag. But what happened was that Mathew was very gullible, and he was in this naive habit of sharing unpublished work with aspiring writers in an age when plagiarism was rife and kind of winked at. People of conscience knew not to do it. It wasn't like everybody, to a man or woman thought that it was ethical, but it was one of those things that socially was more or less acceptable and kind of winked at, even though, like I said, people of conscience and ethical people knew not to do it and refused to do it. Matthew refused to do it. And a number of the people that Matthew probably shared his early work with refused to do it. But there were a few bad apples, including Charles Dickens, Edgar Allan Poe, Margaret Fuller, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who were all people of low character who plagiarized. This is what I've concluded from all the evidence. I'm talking a ton of evidence. So anyway, there you have it. That's as much as I wanted to share today. I hope somebody finds it of interest. When that paper comes out, I've got over 200 names now to write to. About half of them are Poe experts or people strongly interested in Poe, and half of them are people just interested in the poetry of 19th century America or something along that lines. I wanted to split it about even because the Poe people I want to put on notice, knowing that basically none of them will go out of denial long enough to, show any serious interest. Whereas the other half, they don't mention Poe. They mention Hawthorne and they mention Emerson and all kinds of other people of the period, Dickinson, whatever, but they don't mention Poe. There's got to be a reason why they don't include Poe in their studies, and that's probably because they don't like him or they don't trust him. So I want half of the people I write to be those guys, the ones that aren't on the defensive about Poe himself. They'll be on the defensive regarding reincarnation, which I have to mention. See, the thing is, I'm having to publish this first in Real Paranormal Magazine. That means in order to justify putting it in Real Paranormal Magazine, I have to skew it towards reincarnation, towards the paranormal, to show that there's some relevance for putting it in there in the first place. Even though I've been given carte blanche by the editor, still, I have to do my part and show that there's some tie-in with the paranormal. But then I can't rewrite the article before I repost it. So I have to leave the article the way it was published in Real Paranormal Magazine and approach the scholars with that. That means that I have to quickly explain in my cover letter why there's reincarnation in it and that they should just set that aside. That'll probably cut out about 50% of the people I write to at least, who just won't look at it just on the basis of reincarnation being in it. They'll immediately dismiss me as a nutcase because I believe in something that the vast majority of the people of the world believe in. But you see, those vast majority of people that believe in reincarnation, they're savages. We all know, us white people, all know that those people in the third world are savages and they have ignorant mythological beliefs. So we can just dismiss reincarnation and their belief in reincarnation and their majority belief in reincarnation because they're all savages. This is the white supremacy that's deeply ingrained in white people in privileged countries. It's amazing. And I'll tell you what, you have a lot of professors that are politically correct as regards these matters. But I bet you anything, if I sent you something that had to do with reincarnation, they would kick it out on the basis of the same ethnocentrism. It's interesting stuff. All right. Well, amazingly, I don't have too many side effects or any side effects really, other than a little bit of spaciness from that shot. Let's hope it continues that way. And I'm one of the lucky ones. And I can get on with my life, which means looking for some menial part-time job to earn at least $100 a week is what I have to earn in order to be able to keep on an even keel and not continue to dip into my savings. If anybody who's thinking about hiring me for janitor or whatever it is, dog walker or anything else, looks me up online, they will see that I'm a crazy nut who believes in reincarnation and believes that I was this famous author, or not famous author, but author of famous works in a past life. And they won't even allow me into their house to walk their dog. I've many times thought that this is like Back to the Future with the DeLorean that has to make it up to 88 miles an hour before it hits the wall. I've burned my bridges as far as ever having a normal life is concerned. I don't even think I can get a job as a dog walker now because of my internet presence. It forces me. I have to be successful, at least to the tune of $100 a week with this work I'm doing. And I just sold a book, apparently yesterday, something like that. I just noticed that I sold a copy of my print book. Maybe I shame somebody that watches this blog into buying a print book. I hope so. It's a good book. It's only 200 pages, and it's designed to be entertaining and informative and to give an overview. So hopefully whoever bought that, if they're listening, will find that enjoyable. Until next time.